Hello everyone, and welcome back to Realism Overhaul Sandbox in Kerbal Space Program 1.12, where I've been contemplating engines that switch which propellants they use partway through a flight. And there's really only one example of this that I know of, and that's the RD-704/701 from the Soviet Union. And it was a kerosene hydrogen oxygen engine that during the flight would switch to just hydrogen and oxygen. Basically, it was hydrogen and oxygen and use kerosene to increase its thrust initially. And then once it didn't need that much thrust, it would stop using the kerosene. And I've always liked this sort of idea because it basically saves you the boosters. And I wanted to make a methane-hydrogen-oxygen engine, and aside from using it for launch, which is what I have configured down here, I also wanted a lander engine like that because there are places where you can get methane and places where you can't, but also we have the boil-off issue, so I would like an engine that could use methane and oxygen while boil-off is bad, maybe a little bit of hydrogen, and then if you can get the hydrogen, use the hydrogen and oxygen. So this is a very complicated thing to try to do, but in principle, it's not impossible, so we might as well try, okay? So up here on the second stage, I'm using the lander engines, actually. So it's a bimodal engine, and it's got two modes. The first mode is methane, hydrogen, oxygen, and in this case, this mode is using very little of the hydrogen. The assumption is that the hydrogen would have boiled off or something like that, and we only have a little bit left. So we are only using a little bit of hydrogen in this mode, and then in mode 2 it's just pure hydrolox. And so in mode 1 it only gets 383, so it's a bit of a souped up methane oxygen engine, but then in hydrolox mode it gets 455, and it's about a 100 kilonewton engine. And there we have to throttle the hydrogen and the methane. So you shut off the methane, but you also need to modify how much hydrogen is going through along the way. That makes it more complicated than actually the launch engines. In the case of the launch engines, I have made them have a consistent amount of hydrogen mass going through, and so that amount does not change. As a result, the thrust changes. So first we've got methane, hydrogen, oxygen. I think there's a slight change here. Yeah, so we've got 62.7 kilograms per second in the methane, hydrogen, oxygen, and then in mode 2 we've got a little bit more than that. That's just a math error on my part. So really they should be equal. But the oxygen does have to go down to get the proper mixture with the hydrogen, so the oxygen basically throttles down to half, and then the methane gets shut off. The net result is the thrust goes down as well, so in mode 2 the thrust goes down to 60%. So it says unthrottleable, but in this mode it's throttleable because you can just shut off the methane. Technically it should get more efficiency when you shut down the methane, but it's not having that effect. So, but of course we'll just switch modes. We won't use throttling like that. So yeah, these engines are 3,000 kilonewtons when in mode 1, but then 1,800 kilonewtons in mode 2. And the benefit is that you don't really need boosters. You just carry the extra fuel in tanks outside. Ideally, you would just carry the methane in these, not the full mix. But what I wanted to do was to basically propose this as the next Japanese launch vehicle. So the Japanese current fairly new launch vehicle is the H3, and I wanted this to be the H4. And I wanted to keep the body diameter the same as the H3 right now, so they didn't have to create a new body. So that's why I've put the extra fuel in here. Otherwise, this gets a little bit longish. We could just make it longer. But yeah, it's a little bit more efficient to have it over here anyway and dump the empty tanks like that instead of carrying it in the main body. And they're about the same size as the H3 boosters, visibly, except they're not boosters, they're just tanks. So, but yeah, it's nicer to just have the methane out there. and then those will be smaller, and then this will be larger. But I think it'd be better to have a wider body for that. And so the goal here is to, of course, get more payload capacity than the H3 does. Now, because of the engine switching, we have no idea if we're actually getting that. I've tried to estimate and try to figure it out, of course, but I'm gonna have to flight test it to figure it out, and I don't think I'm gonna get Ascent Guidance's help, considering we have to switch the engine mode. So maybe Ascent Guidance can handle it. We'll try it once. And we're trying to get 15 tons to the moon right now. I think we can do more than that, but I think we'll start with 15 tons to the moon. Right now, the H3 can get, I think, about 8 tons to geostationary transfer orbit. So there's a substantial benefit over that, because the moon is further out than geostationary transfer orbit, and 8 tons is less than 15. I think this rocket can do 45 tons to orbit. I'm not using any special tanks, it's just the aluminum gridded tanks, so it's not lithium or copper or whatever. Certainly not balloon tanks. So yeah, they're simple like that, but you know, in practical cases, probably the tanks will be heavier. Still, the hydrogen tank is huge. One of the goals was to not have so huge a hydrogen tank, but we still end up with that. Alright, so let's see if it can do what I think it can do, or whether I need to scale it back. Okay, so here we are, SAS on, throttle is up, ignition. And launch. For once, I put waterfall plumes on my engines for the first, right away. Normally I put the real plumes, but I just put the waterfall plumes. I don't know if people will think that this is a useful kind of engine. I have thought of other tripropellant sort of situations. Really, the lander engine was what I wanted. We'll get to the proper use of the lander engine eventually. So basically it is the same size as the H3. The reason why it's more efficient is because the H3 is using SRBs that get less efficiency. And the core engines don't provide that much thrust. They provide a little bit less than what these do in hydrolox mode. Okay, switching mode. Dumping those. Now these are operating at a higher chamber pressure than the current engines on the H3. There's 3000 psi. Still staged combustion, which the H3 engines, the LE9s, have. But those operate at a lower chamber pressure. These are at the same chamber pressure as the space shuttle main engines, though not as high as the RD-704 or Raptor or anything like that. I wish I could get the RD-704 kind of chamber pressure. That's 4,400 psi. Though in hydrolox mode, it cuts it by, well, in this case, by 60%. And in the case of the RD-704, I think it was to half. Fairing separation. Okay, well, it's going a little bit out of whack here. Alright. A little bit tossed up too high, probably, since we're only using a little bit of this to complete orbit. Yeah, I'm having to tilt down with this. I'll try to up the payload and try it with Ascent Guidance. Maybe, as long as I switch the mode, it'll end up being alright. But initially, it's definitely going to read that it doesn't have enough delta V. And that will confuse it. Well, we certainly have enough to transfer to the moon like that. Alright. Let me put a little bit more on it and see what Ascent Guidance can do. Let's try 16 tons. I'm not gonna push it too much. Alright, well, let's try it. Even with infinite ISP. Well, yeah, I knew that. Are you not going to try at least? I can't throttle up. I don't want a timed launch. Well, I guess I'll launch first and then engage. No, it really doesn't like this. Okay, alright. So I don't think Ascent guidance is going to work with me here. Maybe I can convince it to keep going even though there's not it thinks there's not enough. I don't see option for forcing it to keep going. Yeah, it doesn't want to. I can't throttle up right now. Okay, well, I'm gonna try it myself with the 16 tons. So this is admittedly a unique sort of situation, but it is clearly beyond Ascent guidance unless there is some setting that I'm not aware of, which could be possible. Now, again, it would be nicer to have the methane on the outboard, and it'd also be nicer to have 4 engines instead of 3. I went with 3 engines to make it more like the H3, but probably I would go with 4 engines if they let me. Okay, so anyway, let me get that fairings there, and let's try this again. And launch. So right now, these are getting 367 at the surface, but then they'll top out at 409. The mix between the methane and hydrogen here is 50-50 by mass, not by volume. Of course, the hydrogen takes more volume. On the lander engine, it's different. It's 90% methane, 10% hydrogen by mass. So it doesn't get very good vacuum ISP there, but then it can just switch to the hydrolox mode if it wanted that. And the reason is boil off. Here we don't have to worry about boil off, so we use more of the hydrogen. So the methane is just giving us more thrust right now. Would these engines be hard to make? Yeah, probably. But not something that has never been done. Okay, switched mode. Oh, fairings. Alright, keeping it a bit more restrained. Alright, separation, ignition. I think we can just keep flat now. It might be a little bit tight here. Possibly between 15 and 16 tons is the answer. But yeah, it's debatable whether these things are good ideas or not. But I will try to figure out a way to put them to more use. Of course, we're not even using the methane feature of these engines right now. At 455 seconds, they get a little bit better performance than the regular engine on the upper stage of the H3 rocket from Japan, but less thrust. That's why we have 2 of them. I didn't want too much thrust because, again, lander engine. My lander was not planned to be that powerful or that heavy. Okay, well, maybe with a KOS script handling it, I could get enough to transfer to the moon like this, though I didn't put MLI layers, so this boil off somewhere between 15 and 16 tons to the moon is what we're talking about here. And that's pretty good, considering the capabilities of the current H3 rocket. But, again, engineering it would be complicated, and probably we would, considering how expensive these engines would likely be, we would probably want it to be on a reusable system like Max had the RD704 and at least brought those back because those would have been expensive. So maybe I should figure out if we can use these sorts of engines for something reusable. Thinking about the good thing about the system is that in a space plane, the use of the denser methane compared to hydrogen will give us a better situation than just using pure hydrolox. Though, of course, with space planes, you want as much hydrolox as possible, given how everything shakes up. Anyway, so this is the idea, and I have two types of engines that will eventually be part of the Shearstrut engine pack, but I might change their properties. It's all about how much of the methane we want to use in each case, and maybe I need to reassess potentially what their mass actually is. So yeah, and there's just the vague notion of tripropellant engines that switch midway. And I have other ideas for potential combinations that I might talk about and cook up in later videos. But for now, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. And I'll see you next time.